It's good to be here with you. I don't get to see you as much as I'd like. So instead of just talking about this book, which I said to John, should I just go on this, or can I talk a little about how I got into this business? Are people in here, I don't want to use the word aspiring writers, because obviously people are writers, whether they're published or not, or etc. But I just want to know sort of who the audience is. Are you guys looking to sort of make a career out of this to some degree? All right, enough people are nodding. And sort of tell the story of how I got here, because hopefully it will be inspirational enough to you that if someone like me could be up here addressing you as opposed to sitting out there listening to someone, that you know, it can certainly happen to anyone who puts the time and the work in. You know, the interesting thing about thriller writers is that we didn't start off, most of us, intending to be writers. We all had different careers when we started this, and as you know, thriller writers tend to be ex-reporters or ex-doctors or ex-lawyers or ex-CIA agents, perhaps. And I spent 20 years learning how to write about crime by spending 2 decades in the women's clothing business. So my folks had a pretty large, diversified apparel company. I don't know if anyone will know the name here. It will only be by age. So they're called Leslie Fay. Does anyone remember that name? So my mom's name is Leslie Fay, actually. And you know, by the time I was graduating college, even though I wrote in college and edited the literary magazine in school and as an undergraduate, which was sort of a big deal at the time, but it was always sort of known that I was headed into that industry. And so I sort of, when I got out of school, I went out to Colorado. I actually opened a restaurant there that didn't do ultimately so well. And when I came back, there was sort of no plan B for me at that point. I was going into business. I went, got an MBA at Columbia here, and ended up at Leslie Fay. Well, the great thing about being in a family-run business is that you can usually, your career can grow to the degree that, you know, your responsibilities grow to the degree that you are ready for them. The bad thing about being in a family business, though, is that, at least in my case, is that it was filled with your own family. And I had a hard time sort of merging my own sense of self-worth at that point with this pretty large company. It was close to $1 billion in sales, when $1 billion meant something. It had, I don't remember, but maybe 25, 30 different divisions to it. And I ended up, I guess, running about a third of it and on the board. And in any case, at some point, it just seemed the right thing that I ended up outside of this family business. At that time in life, I really wasn't thinking about anything other than making myself into the strongest manager as I could be, probably doing as well as I could be. And that was the extent of my life. I mean, I read, I thought I was always a savvy reader. I could always express myself at a sales meeting. I wrote memos that probably belonged in the Memo Hall of Fame, but that said, I was just trying to do my job as well as I could do, and I guess make whatever money I could make. But at some point, I found myself outside this business, or outside the company, and I got involved in what are called turnarounds, getting involved in companies that were underperforming and not worth what they on paper would be worth, or the brand might call for. And I would, and all in the sports apparel business. So the first one was a company called Head. So if anybody plays tennis or skis, it still is a worldwide brand. If you're watching Djokovic or Andy Murray play tennis, they're using Head rackets. And Lindsey Vonn skis on Head skis. But And that was actually a terrific turnaround. And it was actually a Harvard text case working on it. And so that was good. Then I got involved in a French firm called Le Coq Sportif, which has a rooster and a triangle, and going back into the 80s, when there was actually sort of like an upper end to sports apparel, tennis or ski apparel. That was not in ski, that was mostly in tennis. That one sort of didn't go so well, and I was kind of lucky to be able to unload it back to Adidas, who I bought it for. And then I got involved in a Canadian skiwear company that not only didn't turn around, it didn't turn around in such a spectacular manner that I ended up on a Wednesday out of a job, out of a career. I came home. My wife, who was never used to seeing me other than maybe 8 o'clock, you know, said, like, what are you doing here? And I said, you know, out of a job, you know. And so she looks at me. We have 3 kids in private school, Westchester, you know, living a sort of life that comes with that, I guess. And she says, what are we going to do? And I looked at her and I said a couple of words that she never thought she'd ever hear from me, and I said, we're going to write a novel. So, you know, I guess that over time I've been noodling something out, because whether you're a writer and you're dormant, or whether you think of yourself when you're young, I always sort of measured myself against that career, and I've been noodling something out. And I said to her, look, I want a year. You know, we can afford it. I've earned it. I deserve it. You know, just give me a year. I remember couching it in all of these sort of quasi-MBA terms about auditing my progress and, you know, getting a, you know, whatever it is, how we would look at this, so it wasn't completely frivolous. And because Lynn was 12 years a yoga teacher at that point, and self-actualization was very important on her list of priorities, I knew that I had that sale made. So anyway, so I got my year. And anyone who's been writing a novel knows it doesn't take a year to write a first novel. It may take a year to put the words on paper the first go around, and it may take another year to polish those words into something presentable. And it probably takes a 3rd year to market it, to try to market it. And so fast forward 3 years, I had this political conspiracy novel. It was called Hydra. It was about a right-wing takeover of the United States through a militant wing of the NRA, which, if I realized then, was the subject of nonfiction instead of fiction, I probably would have been published a bit earlier than I ended up being published. But so I finally get this Hydra, but at that point I had all of these rejections from agents. Clearly, in a query letter, my background of some success in the women's clothing or the sports apparel field didn't go a long way to convince someone that I had, you know, the chops for this sort of thing. And here I am 3 years away from anything revenue generating, not even in touch with people that I used to be in my Rolodex, so to speak. And all those people at the beginning of this process, and I'm sure some of you know these yourselves, these kind of people, who were all like, Andy's following his dreams, so great, you know, the first go around 3 years before, and now basically looking at me going to my wife, what the fuck is Andy doing with his life? He's destroying his life, you know? But I had this book, and you know, I kept on getting rejections, and I kept on, every time I got a rejection, I actually think business made me a lot stronger to do it, because it heartened me. I never got, I mean, of course I got dejected. Anyone would get dejected, especially when you sort of felt, as I'm sure you can relate to, that this agent really seems to like it, or I just have some hope here. And when it would come back, you know, we all get rejected. But I would take what I could that was good out of it, and literally after like an hour of moping, I would go back up there and try to improve my manuscript. And finally, I found an agent, and a pretty good one, actually, is Richard Pine. I think he's still at work here, you know, and it was really lucky because at that stage, all you really want are readers. You know, it's hard to get anybody in the trade to even read your book. And whether you're looking for an assessment or someone to sort of, you know, take it to the next level. And I found this guy who worked for Random. He was a Random House in London, and he was a relative of friends of where my kids were in school, someone we knew from there, and he got this person to read it. Sadly, he died recently. But he got me to Richard Pine, and then Richard Pine reads this, and suddenly he says, this book is great, you know? And all of a sudden, somebody's interested in my book. And they're gonna, you know, after, you know, maybe a month of polishing it up and getting it ready to submit, they're gonna submit this thing. And I remember Richard, they said, just get out of town. You know, you're making me nervous, because I have that capacity, you know. So they said, just go out of town, go somewhere, have fun, and when you come back, you're gonna have a book contract. So now, all the things we've sort of gone through in the last 3 years are suddenly gonna pay off. And so we decided to go to Nantucket, to the Walnut Inn, which we really couldn't afford at that point, and we were eating and drinking all this wine that we couldn't afford, that was gonna come out of our advance that we were gonna get, you know, celebrating this book deal that hadn't happened yet. And basically, because there were a lot more publishers at that stage than there are now, I think after 10 days or 2 weeks, whatever it was, I think I had 22 or 23 rejection letters. And that was my period of being demoralized. Then I didn't really know what my next step was, because as you either know or will find out, when an agent suddenly doesn't have something to sell from you, it isn't a soft landing, it's call me when you have something. And I didn't have something. And now these 3 years look just like a long path of you know, I'd gone down the wrong turn in the road of life. I would not have written another book, because that would have been completely frivolous, and I wouldn't have dragged my family through it. You know, I crossed something off my bucket list, and that would have been it. And I would have tried to find a way to elbow myself back into business, which would not have been pretty, because I was 3 years removed from it, and nobody really wants you at that point. I kind of remember that I was up in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Anyone ever been there? There's like 5 corners, or they're saying there's a gourmet shop there, and I was trying to convince my wife we should buy this gourmet shop in Williamstown, Massachusetts, because they had a great business in Christmas baskets, or, you know, gourmet Christmas baskets. And she's like, you mean I'm going to be sitting there? That's what I'm going to be doing in life now, is wrapping Christmas baskets, you know? And I was, but I do remember sitting around my den, just sort of wondering what cliff I was going to drive our SUV off of, and then sort of getting more depressed that we lived at sea level, and you know, that wasn't going to happen. And then out of the blue, phone rings, and I get a call, and someone says, I pick it up, and someone says, can you take a call from James Patterson? The truth is, I would have taken a call from my gate guard if they had something nice to say about Hydra, which is the name of my book. I didn't have to talk to Patterson, but you know, just sort of pausing the you know, 4 or 5 seconds, so I didn't show, you know, what level my life was in at that moment. I sort of went, yeah, I can talk to him. Now, James Patterson at that time, going back now 16 or 17 years, was not the Patterson everyone thinks of now. He was not a branded author the way he certainly has been for a while. He did not have this list of #1 bestsellers. In fact, he hadn't had a #1 bestseller at that point. He had not had Harvard case studies named after him. Actually, I had one. And I had not read a page of his. Although at that point, arguably his two best books, I guess, Kiss the Girls and Along Came the Spiders were written. But I said, yeah, I can talk to him. Of course, I knew who he was, and he actually called back, and he gets on the phone and he goes, I read your book. And I went like, read my book, you know? I'm assuming that my manuscript is in every wastebasket on Madison Avenue. What do you mean, like you read my book? And unbeknownst to me, it was given to him by the head of Little Brown at that time. Actually, the head of Warner Books and EVP of Little Brown, her name was Maureen Egan. Is that a name you know? Anyone know? Yeah. And they had rejected it, but she wrote 5 letters on the cover of the book. This guy does women well, which I tend to think meant that I wrote him well because the hero of my novel, unpublished novel, Hydra, was a strong-willed gal, took place in Dallas actually, who provided the heroic element of the book, and you know, he needed to connect with someone like that. So all the stars kind of lined up that, you know, Maureen knew that he may have needed something. You know, she gave him my unpublished book that they had decided not to publish, and he reads it. And he calls up and he says, you got the goods. And I said, huh, you know? He goes, I read your book, and I want to meet and talk to you about something. So at that point, I hadn't read a word, as I say, of Patterson's. We agreed to meet 2 days later. I never remember the name of the diner, but it's on Westchester Avenue in White Plains. It's just, as you get older, things go bye-bye. And so we agreed to meet for breakfast 2 days later. And in those 2 days, I think I became the Otto Penzler of James Patterson, because I think I read everything that he'd written in those 2 days. And we go to meet for breakfast, and basically he's sitting there ahead of me. We get there, we move to the back of the place, and he tells me, you know, well, you could rework this if you wanted to. And he starts to tell me what he thought was wrong about it, that it just didn't have the pace and a couple of things. Or let me throw something out and see if this in any way interests you. And he starts to talk about this idea that he has for 4 women crime fighters. It hadn't been set in a city yet. He wants to write a separate series to his Alex Cross series, which at that time was such a remarkable thought and proposal that you would sort of scratch your head and you go, well, you already have one series, you know. And he knew he couldn't devote the full time to it, and wanted someone to come in and do it. And the more he's talking and outlining this idea that he has, the more I'm sort of sitting there going, thank you, God. Because I didn't have a plan B. This was it, you know. And, you know, the skies had opened up and given me this moment. And I listened to what he said. He said, I'd like to take a stab at this. I went home. I wrote 2 chapters that day. I remember thinking that I'm going to show him I don't know how to write with pace. And I went home and I wrote like the 2 most combustible, locomotive chapters that anybody had ever, I was going to say put to paper, but of course, you know, it was computer. And I faxed it to him. Based on his idea, we talked about maybe what chapter 1 and chapter 2 might be. And as he always did, he read them immediately. He called me back, I'm going to say within half an hour of receiving my stuff. And he says to me, not bad, but if we're going to work together, someone's going to have to teach you how to write with pace. But he took me on, and we did this book. I can't name the book because I'm still sort of, I don't know when the statute of limitations runs out on ghostwriting. It probably has, but it was the beginning book of this series, just to be not so oblique about it. And I don't know, he probably thought it was a short leash. I thought it was an incredibly long leash. I remember how much of the storyline I got to create. And the book is done, it comes out, and it immediately goes to #1. And not only does it go to #1, but over time it becomes the best sell-through that Little Brown has ever experienced on a fiction book. And everybody is overjoyed. And I thought that, all along in this process, that all that would happen is I wanted to do my own stuff. And that I would do this one book, and Patterson would tee me up to somehow, would get an idea, and then I'd go and do my own thing. And I actually kind of remember, I'll digress a second, but I remember at some point, right in the middle of this process, he says, Andy, I got an idea for you. I want you to listen to it. It's about this Russian crime boss. And he starts telling me this story about this FBI agent whose best friend is another FBI agent, and they're chasing this Russian crime boss, this nasty guy out of Brooklyn, and they corner him somewhere, I think in the islands, like at Montauk, and the guy shoots his best friend, the other agent. They capture him, kills him. He captures him. The guy's in Rikers Island. He somehow, before trial, takes a gun from someone, shoots the guard guarding him, runs out of Rikers Island, or manages to get across that bridge there. He's in a bus or a truck, and he's driving in the Bronx, and he's shooting people, and somehow getting away. Then he gets on the on the Whitestone Bridge, and he's going north to get out of New England, and he blows up the Whitestone Bridge behind him. And when he was telling me this, I was thinking, this is the stupidest effing story I've ever heard in my whole life. I'm not going to write this story. But at some point, after the book comes out, they had me come in to Little Brown, and it's the best day of my life, because I've now been involved in a #1 bestseller, though my name is nowhere near it. But I've never even met a publisher. I've never even shaken hands with a publisher or anybody in the industry. So I go up there and I get off the elevator, and I remember seeing like Michael Crichton and Janet Ivanovich and all these like heavyweight these big blow-ups, and their covers are there, and it's really impressive. And I walk into this office, and there's probably more people in the office than there are in this room now, and everyone's eager to see me, and they all like turn around when I come in. And Michael Peace is there, who's now the head of the company, but then he was the Patterson's agent, and he says to me, at some point, they all turn around, they go, so what's next for Andy Gross? After throwing a lot of compliments on me, And I go, oh God. I said, well, I'm not stupid. I said, I had this idea about a Russian crime boss. And I start to map it out, throwing in a few details that sort of made it mine. And there's a silence. And I'm sure that I'm about to be said, well, thank you very much for coming in, and I'm done. My career is over before it started. And Michael Peace looks at me and he goes, you got a book. I went, I got a book? He goes, you got a book. We're going to call Richard, blah, 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 we'll work it out. And I sort of get tossed out of the office. My legs are jelly-like. I go down the elevator. I'm walking on 6th Avenue because that's where they were at that point. And I call my wife up and I go, honey, we just got a book. We're going to have a book deal. I said, however, I don't want to write this book. This book is awful, And later that night, Patterson calls me up and he goes, look, Andy, you could write this book, but how about doing another one with me? And I was very willing and eager to say, yes, you got it. And so we did another one, and my name got on that one. At some point, I know Jim had called me up and he said, Andy, I know you're going to find the fault in this, but there's nothing to find fault with this about. Your name is going on the cover. And I said, well, that's great. Like, what could anybody find fault with about that? And then a year later, when it was published, I saw what it was, because my name was about like this, and Patterson's is like that, and you couldn't even read my name at that one. But I did a bunch of books, and progressively they got larger, and my name got larger, and then it got to equal billing, and at some point, I was very happy in that life, but wanting to do my own thing, and waiting for a 7th treatment from him, because we always started out with outlines of some sort from Jim. I actually went to a dinner party. I'm spending a lot of time with Jim, but went to a dinner party up in Westchester, and we get to this party, and there's two his and her Ferraris with their same license plate, one of her, one of him, in front of the house, and we go in and we meet these two totally objectionable people talking about, you know, their kids are now out of the house and they've got all this glamour travel and they've got these big rings and jewelry, and they were totally icking us out. And we get back in the car, and I said something like, you know, well, thank God we don't have to see those people ever again. I probably didn't phrase it as nicely, you know. And then a month later, I'm reading the Times in the morning, waiting for my seventh thing from Patterson, you know, reading the Times, and there below the fold is the picture of this person, of this guy, and he's been arrested for laundering money to the Colombians. And so I started prancing around my kitchen going, I told you he was a schmuck, you liked him, you thought he was funny, but I told you, right? And as I'm doing that, something actually hits me. And it's not so much about this guy and this guy's life and how bad he was. It's really about his family. And I'm thinking of it like, we had daughters of a similar age at that point. And here's a guy that was a larger-than-life guy that belonged to the right clubs, that took the right trips, drove the right cars, everyone thought of him highly. And it turns out that his entire life is a sham, that he's been laundering money, that his wealth and status is based on this terrible thing. And how must his daughters feel, or his sons, when they look at their whole life and look at their father and look at him now with shame. And something began to percolate in me, and I ended up outlining, just putting things down on paper, and basically just cutting to the chase. Maybe 7-8 weeks later, I got this pretty thick outline. I outlined very extensively, and I don't know what to do with it because I'm still thinking Patterson's going to drop something on me. But I decide that I'm going to take the plunge, and I try to see if I can get an agent. And I know who I want as an agent, not Richard, but time had elapsed, but someone at Writer's House. And so it took me 2 years to find an agent the first time. I sent a fax in about what I've been doing the last 6 years and all these #1 bestsellers and all of this stuff. And within 2 minutes, Simon calls me back, literally, and says, when can you come in? And I said, I'll come in whenever you want me. He says, bring that outline. So I bring this outline that wasn't quite ready. We go into his office. He sits me down. I'm looking at all the fancy people that he edits, that he represents. He takes the outline. We schmooze a little. He takes the outline. He starts to read a page or 2 or 3. I'm assuming he's going to read no more than 5, and then he'll say, well, let me sit with it a while. He keeps reading. He keeps reading. 40 minutes later, he gets to the end of this thing. And I look at him, and I go, so, is this publishable? He goes, oh, I think we can do something with it. And I think about a week later, there were 4 publishers bidding on this outline, which, as John, doesn't happen in fiction very often. You usually have to complete a book. And using all of the acumen that I learned at Columbia, getting an MBA, I decided to go with the one that offered the most money. So that turned out to be HarperCollins. And now, I have this book. It was called The Blue Zone. I guess it got to number 10 in the New York Times. It got published into about 20 countries. And for me, it was a big thing. It got me a long contract there. It started out with 3 books, and then they bumped it up to 9 books. And I just remember thinking when I got this 6-book extension, all of them just said, untitled book number 1, untitled book number 2, untitled book number 3. It went all the way to 6. And I'm thinking, how am I even going to come up with these things? I have no idea. I mean, I just wanted to write 1 book. I have no idea what these books are going to be about. But like all things in life, time passes. The imagination is limitless. And I came up with, when they're paying you enough, you come up with ideas. I guess, did fairly well. A bunch of my books did make the list. And I wrote suburban thrillers. I guess now I'm going to try to pivot into this for a few minutes and call it a day, take some questions. I wrote 9 books. Basically, if there's such a category, suburban thrillers, meaning what? Upscaled environment, successful people, people you might look at through a lens and see yourself, and who usually either have one foot in good values, family values, etc., and maybe the other foot into something murky, or a wife may go into a hotel room that she shouldn't go into with a guy, make one misstep, and then their worlds fall apart. And for me, it was a way, how do you entrap them, and how do you extricate them? And it usually involves saving the kids and all that. I think you guys know the genre. And all of my books were this sort of pattern. And the deftness of deft with a T, deftness of you as a writer was how you could conceal that this was basically a formula. That, I was decent at it, I knew how to do it, I knew these people, I knew how to create plots, and you try to rework everyone so that there's a little different of something at stake, but basically you're writing the same story. And I felt, as I went on and on in these books, that I was pushing a boulder uphill. At first I started out fairly Pattersonian, but that's not who I am. It's not what I like to read. It's not the voice that I really thought was my real voice, but it's what the publisher wanted. Publishers, even if you have other ideas, which I did at times, consistency is the linchpin of their attempt to brand you. They want something that's easy to sell at their sales meetings to their reps, and they want something that the reps will find easy to sell to retailers. And therefore, whenever I sort of threw stuff out, I would always get, well, that's a good idea, but how about we save that for the next book? Well, there was always a next book and a next book. And like I said, I felt that I was pushing a boulder uphill, trying to come up with new ways to entrap and then extricate these characters. And then what happened? At some point, my contract came to an end. An idea stared me in the face. And I said, what the hell? Let me let the boulder fall. And what stared me in the face was my father-in-law, who came to this country in 1939, April of 1939, 6 months before the war broke out. He never knew the face of anybody in his family, and he was the only person in his family to survive the war. I knew him 33 years, and he always carried this mantle of sadness around with him. He could never get at what it was. He never spoke about his life back in Poland, not even to his own daughter. My wife's a twin, to my brother-in-law or Lynn. They didn't even know the names of their own grandparents. He couldn't, like a lot of survivors, he just couldn't bring this back. The yoke of memory was too painful for him. When he was here a couple of years and America got into the war in 1941, he decided to enlist in the army of his adopted country, and because of his facility with languages, they put him in the OSS. And predictably, he never talked about his work in intelligence either. So they knew nothing about it. And I decided really that what I wanted to write was the story that he would tell. So the one man begins basically in this military old age hospital, veterans old age hospital, with a guy in his 90s, his hand shaking, CNN is on, but he's not even watching. He's got a caretaker in the room with him, and his daughter comes in to visit. And after a little small talk about how is he said he never was very happy, we never could get him to talk about very much. She says, "Pop, I have to show you something." His wife has just died, her mother, and in cleaning out the house, she's come upon a couple of things. And she takes out of her bag 3 things. One of them is a photograph of an attractive woman, a dog-eared photo in a rowboat, rowing a rowboat with her sailor's cap up, who she has no idea who it is. The other is a chess piece, and it's a white rook. And the third thing is something amazing. She takes out of this velvet pouch a medal. And as she says, not just any medal, Pop, this is the Distinguished Service Cross. This is only given for acts of the greatest valor. How did you possibly get something like this? Mm-hmm. And at some stage, after resisting his whole life, he said, "You really want me to tell you?" And she goes, "Yes, Pop, we've always wanted to hear it." And he goes, "Well, it starts with two men who were running for their lives. And those two men are Joseph Verba and Joseph Wetzler and Rudolf Verba, who are the only two people to have successfully escaped Auschwitz. And they get themselves in the hands of the Polish resistance, who takes them to the Slovakian border. And what they brought with them is documentation of all the atrocities that are taking place inside Auschwitz, which for the first time come out. It's never come out before. Everyone always suspected that these atrocities were taking place because obviously, massive amounts of Jews were being transported from towns and never being heard from again. But no one could really show what was happening in them, and this was the first time. And within literally weeks, their accounts land on the desk of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his war council. And everyone is trying to push him to act and do something, whether it's bombing the railroad tracks or running missions to free Jews in these camps. I won't go into it here, but for various reasons, FDR, who obviously was a great humanitarian, was really no friend of the Jews at that stage, even though he had a bunch of Jews in his cabinet, certainly, and did nothing. But they do try to authorize one mission, and that mission is to try to find someone in Europe who they need, who they think can help win them the war. And that person is someone named Alfred Mendel. And Mendel is an atomic physicist. Actually, the one man in one sentence is the story of an escaped Polish Jew who is convinced to go back to where his parents were murdered in order to bring out the one man that the Allies think can win them the war. And that man is an atomic scientist, and the place that he's ended up is Auschwitz. So I'll say one quick thing about Auschwitz. I didn't set out to write the definitive story on the Holocaust. That's been done certainly in the camps by people who went through it firsthand. I only wanted to do it if I could add something to it. And I sort of feel that I have, and I guess according to the criticism or the positive criticism I've got, people might agree with that. But if you read the flap copy, I don't even think Auschwitz is anywhere on it, because to me this is a story of affirmation. It's not a story of atrocity. I wanted to write a story about heroism, and that's what this camp is to me. And sort of it provides the daily threat to one's life that I needed for my hero to accomplish his mission. Basically, it's a thriller because he's got 72 hours to be sent back there, to find someone in this mass of humanity and to smuggle him out. They have a plan. It's a credible plan. And there is a ticking clock and an impossible mission. I guess, that leads us to this book. Now, I'll just close with one quick anecdote. After my father-in-law passed away, which was this year before the book came out, my wife was going through his closets and came across something extraordinary. And that was a bundle of letters written to him by his mother, by her grandmother, that they never knew about, that he never shared. And we had them translated in one day because we were having a memorial for him. And in those letters, they saw a modern, funny, totally positive woman who, for the first time, they got a glimpse into their grandmother, who no one ever knew before. the two things that were really interesting on these letters is that it starts out, they must have been in their regular home when it first started. This was the first year that their son, that my father-in-law, got to the States, and they were written from their original home, and then that changed. And as we looked it up later, it was clear that the second house became part of the ghetto, and of the Warsaw Ghetto. And they were suddenly written from Warsaw, Deutschland, Warsaw/Deutschland, which was interesting. And they all were stamped then, the subsequent ones, with a swastika, which we took to be a censor's approval that these could be sent. And all the letters said Nathan, because his name was Nathan too, so it's the character in there. Why haven't you written us? Why have we not heard from you? How is life in America? Is everything all right? Please write us. We're worried about you. They were worried about him. And then eventually they died. And if he was writing, which he probably was, they were never delivered. And so they died not knowing if their son loved them, or if he thought of them, or what his plight was. And so I sort of discovered, I set out to try to find out what was behind his sadness in this process. And I think we learned that his sadness was that they died never having received a letter from him, which is a very compelling thing. So I guess if my book has acted in any way as an agent for that understanding, it served a good purpose. So with that,
We have time for a quick question.
okay, too, I'm sorry if I went on too long, but please.
How much research did you do for this book?
Normally you write these suburban thrillers, you can always wing something under the guise of fiction, I thought you don't wing about the Holocaust. The bar of responsibility is just a bit too high on that one. So just to give you an idea, I probably read 8 or 9 first-hand accounts of life inside. I read books on FDR's treatment of the Jew, in his treatment of the Jews. I read books on atomic physics, and there is a little atomic physics in this, but I think it's delivered in a really, people find it really interesting because it's given as part of an argument, but I thought it was important to know what it was. I don't know if you've gotten to that stage, but I thought it was important to know what it was that Alfred Mendel knew that they wanted, it was so important they get him out. So everyone gets a little lesson in that, and chess is a theme of the book too. So they were all things I sort of had to know about. So quite a bit, but I think the beauty of this book actually is in the richness of the detail. There's also a lot of rabbinical law in the book. I've even had a couple of rabbis write me, telling me how they really enjoyed how some of that law helped them help the character here make up his mind, because the reason he goes back basically is to perform an aliyah. I don't know if anybody knows that word, but when you're bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, you make a pledge to go to Israel, and his Israel was going back to the place where his parents died. So my character makes that pledge. So quite a bit, Yes.
What do you plan to do going forward? And if
You
it's
mean
like
profession?
that,
You mean in writing?
Yeah, I'm right. And if I'm interested in your approach to all the research you did to this, and if you do plan to write another one, do you think it'll involve that degree of research?
Well, here's my answer. One of the benefits of having this book a year and a half in the hopper with the publisher was that I've already finished the next one. And it's another World War II book, but there's no Jews in this book. It's actually Norwegians and Brits, and it's about a raid in Norway, a very heroic raid that I came across reading for this book, about how basically it's one man. It could be called a one-man too. One man literally ended the Nazis' attempts to create an atomic bomb, and it's such a daring thing that really isn't known about in this country that I said I have to put this into a book as well. This next one's a little more like Alistair MacLean of Where Eagles Dare or The Guns of Navarone. It's a little more in that theme, but so I'm staying in it at least for the next one. Anyone else?
Well, I just wanted to just thank you, but I'm also saying we can go over there and buy the book, right? It's going to be really nice. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.